Hey there! We are the Leadership Lab team, and we're exploring the practical application of leadership concepts and achieving excellence.
We go beyond the classroom. We take these concepts into the wild and learn about challenges and triumphs of leaders applying these ideas in their leadership journeys.
And this is Mastery Talks, the podcast where we bridge the gap between academic knowledge and real-world leadership challenges. In each episode, we dive deep into the groundbreaking research and teachings of Stanford GSB faculty, exploring the foundational concepts that power the elite courses.
Join us on this journey, share your leadership stories, and together, let's master the art of leadership excellence.
Good day, dear leaders, and welcome back to another enlightening episode of Mastery Talks. I'm your host, Yana, together with Juliana, my co-host, and it's truly a pleasure to have you with us. Today, we're honored to host Professor Bill Barnett, a leading authority in business leadership and strategy at Stanford. Bill directs influential programs like Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability, Executive Program Be a Leader Who Matters, and most importantly, Bill helps us to increase our chances of being great as our dear professor of strategic leadership in LEAD.
This research has provided profound insights into why some companies succeed while others falter, and how effective leaders can shape the destiny of organizations. Our conversation will revolve around two fundamental functions of leadership: sense-making and direction.
So let's dive into this. Welcome, Professor Barnett. How are you feeling today?
Doing great. Thanks so much, guys. Do you hear me loud and clear?
We hear you absolutely well.
Excellent. Well, hello, all you leaders, and thank you so much, Yana and Juliana, for this very innovative event and podcast that you put together. So I just think it's awesome. I would prefer to make it as much as possible Q&A, but I will give some opening comments. But since you've had all of you have studied the LEAD material, you'll remember that I talk a lot about discovery. I think it's fair to say that since I came to Stanford back in 1991, that's right, I've been here since 1991. So I don't know what you were doing in 1991, but I was doing this. We weren't online yet. They hadn't invented the internet as we know it, but I was teaching strategy and such. I think since then, I think we can come away with two. If you had to sum up everything we've learned about strategy and organization since then, I could do it with two sentences. The first is that we are terrible at predicting. We do not see what's coming next, but we don't realize that because of the second thing that we have learned, and that is that we are really good at retrospectively rationalizing all of those things that we didn't predict. We're so good at retrospective rationalization, and you'll remember this from the LEAD course material, which I was presenting to you. We're so good at retrospectively rationalizing that we think that other people's successes were planned because the retrospective rationalizations just look so good. But in fact, they were discovered. And a big part of leadership, as we talked about, is making sense out of it. Information as it comes in, and then building and updating the logic of our strategy so that it considers that new information, seizes those new opportunities, and the best way to go about doing that is as a leader is through a system I call leading by design. Right now, all of this should be ringing bells for you because this is what was in the material in the strategy course. But I just want to remind you, I know you get a lot of information that comes at you, and leading by design is an approach to leadership that basically takes the focus off of what you know. It says, look, the important thing is not what you know. As a leader, your job is not to know what's next. As a leader, your job is to design the systems that discover and create what's next. Okay, and so that's a very different approach because it shifts your attention to how you staff, to the architecture, to the routines, to the culture. It shifts your attention away from you being the person who sees to instead creating a context where your people can discover things that you would never have imagined. Okay, and so that's the general philosophy. Right now, I'm in the middle of some studies of leading by design applied to environmental sustainability. As Yana and Juliana mentioned, that's the area where that I'm now pushing. And in fact, I'll give you a little backstory on this. Right before COVID, I was asked by the president of Stanford and the provost of Stanford to advise on the creation of a school of sustainability. Given the areas that I work in, it turns out that at universities, at Stanford as well, the scientists are brilliant, but they don't know anything about organizing or strategy. There's nothing. So my role was to advise them on creating a school of sustainability. And well, I've always thought sustainability was super important, and I wanted to move my research in that direction. And so I just saw this as a tremendous opportunity. So I told them, yes, I will advise you. And in fact, if this works, which it did, we created the Stanford Door School of Sustainability. I said, if this works, I will join your school. So I now have a split professorship. Half of me is in the business school where I run the organization behavior, the macro organization behavior area. And the other half of me is the chair of the Department of Environmental Behavioral Science here at the Stanford Door School of Sustainability. And I'm creating my faculty and I are creating a new PhD program and a new undergraduate program. So I am really steeped in sustainability, and I apply the lessons of leading by design to that work. So you can ask any questions you want around sustainability, and I'd be happy to address those as well.
Thank you, Professor, for this context and your amazing path to this point. Let's then dive right away to the heart of strategic leadership. And I want to talk a bit about your work, where you highlighted that one of the critical functions of leadership is helping your people make sense of complex developments, which you term sense-making. Could you break down why this is so important and what exactly sense-making means?
Sure. In fact, I'll do it with a story. So most people have heard the story of Airbnb. And in fact, you've probably heard the story of Airbnb too often, because I know the founders of Airbnb and have a case study on them and such. And they have given so many TED Talks that the narrative has taken on a life of its own, kind of like it is in families. You know what I'm talking about? Where there's kind of stories about the family and they take on a life of their own, almost independent of actual reality. So look, Airbnb famously started as a desperate attempt by some programmers to create a platform so they could rent an extra room and just make their rent, right? I mean, it was nothing like what you think now. And does anybody know the valuation of Airbnb today? By the way, I'm just wondering if somebody could type it in the chat as we do this. Now, I want you to remember, it's most of you can probably remember this, but there was a period early in the 21st century where, $74 billion. Okay, that's a pretty hefty market capitalization.
All right.
Okay, and so, but there was a period back in the early 21st century when people talked about something they called the sharing economy. I don't know if you remember that. Okay, the sharing economy. Now, what they were really getting at was peer-to-peer commerce. It's not sharing. I don't know what you teach your kids, but when I say that you should share your cookie with your sister, it doesn't mean you charge her money for the cookie. So, I'm just saying. But nonetheless, the point is the sharing economy is what people, the idea is, maybe, we were just beginning to envision services like Lyft or Uber and such, right? And so, and Airbnb for that matter. And so there was this there was a belief at the time, there was an assumption, and remember, from the work that Jesper did with you in our course, every strategy has a set of assumptions, right? And there was an assumption in the old view that we had about the sharing economy that people would not share and charge money and use, for their car or their or get in the car of a stranger or a house of a stranger. They would not do this with a complete stranger. There was a belief that you had to have some bond and affinity. And of course, we now know that that assumption is incorrect. Like every day, we get in the car of a stranger. It's amazing. One of my kids my youngest daughter is a student at Stanford right now. She's an undergraduate. So she'll tell me, Dad, I'm going to go to a party. It'll happen this Friday. She'll say, Dad, I'm going to go to a party. She lives in a dorm. And I'll say, okay, honey, just be sure when the party's over to get in an old Toyota driven by a complete stranger, probably a guy, alone, okay, and have him drive you back to the dorm, okay? That's actually what I say to her. Not in those words. It's incredible. Like, you would not think that I would do this, right? Back in the year 2005, people didn't think this was going to happen. They thought you had to have an affinity. So what happened with the Airbnb guys is they said, okay, here's what we'll do. Well, when they tried to turn this into a platform, they said, what we'll do? Everybody knows how it is when you go to a conference and you forgot to book a hotel. And now you're out of luck. There's no vacancies. I remember there was a conference in Seattle one time and I didn't book a hotel. And my secretary said the only availability is at the Sandman Motel. Right. And when I Googled it up, it came up, the first hit was bedbugs.net, and I was like, oh my God, I just like, no way. Come on, give me a break. And so, so everybody knows about this, right? So these guys thought, what we'll do is we'll go to conferences and we'll put the platform out so that all the people at the conference, because they have an affinity with each other and they can all, right? And so the first one they did was the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver, Colorado, the convention that gave America its great President Obama, okay? And so they said, this will be great. We'll put the platform out. It'll be a democratic love fest. They'll all sleep on each other's couches. It'll be great, right? We'll make money. Well, the system crashed. Okay, and the system crashed because there were too many people trying to get on it. Now, how does the leadership of Airbnb make sense of this? Okay, they looked at it and they said, oh, this is a problem. This is a problem because our strategy is that the Democrats are supposed to be sleeping on each other's couches. But if you look at these people who are getting on the website, they're not even Democrats. They're Republicans getting on this. There's all sorts of people getting on this web. There are foreigners getting on this website. They don't seem to understand our strategy. So the way that leadership made sense out of it is they blame the customer, which is what companies love to do. Like the customer doesn't seem to read the strategy statement. And so they put up barriers. So you had to be a Democrat, right? You had to go. And then they did it again in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest. And it crashed again. All these people trying to get on the website. There were real Texans trying to get on there, not just people from Austin. And at that point, the CTO, Nate, stopped and said, wait a minute, all these people trying to get on the website, wait a minute. Maybe this is calling into question our assumption that strangers won't do business with each other, right? And so, sure enough, It was at that point that they opened up and really shifted the business to be for everybody. Now, what's interesting is if they had fixed it, if they had engaged in sense making in such a way they stayed with the old strategy, they'd be worth a few $1 million. But because they recognized the opportunity, sense making in that direction, they're worth $74 billion, right? And so what you'll always hear people talk about the pivot. And the important part of the pivot is not the pivot, it's the recognition of the business opportunity that the assumption behind the strategy is being called into question. That is what I mean when I say sense making. As a leader, you're trying to clarify for people the meaning of new information. What does it mean that a particular bit of information is coming? Your people don't know that. If I were to go into your business and go talk to your people, would they know why they come to work, how their job matters? And if not, what does that say about you as a leader?
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story. And it explains so well the whole concept. And as you mentioned, the decisions by leaders of the company are so important. And the question is, there is a difference between a good leader and a great leader in terms of making sense of changes. What are the key qualities that set great leaders apart in this aspect?
Well, the good versus great, I'm never really clear on the good-great distinction. I would say that the way to think about good is maintaining the status quo, right? And great is having the courage to make people uncomfortable. And it's hard to create change and become great. And basically the reason is that people are always comfortable with the status quo. And typically people don't want to advocate for strategic change until they can see concrete evidence that that strategic change is going to be advantageous. Of course, the trouble is we don't know that strategic change is going to be advantageous until we engage in that change. And so if you wait until people are comfortable, you will never be a great leader. The mark of being a great leader is that you make people uncomfortable.
Yes, I think that in your work you mentioned that sense making, when formalized and, as you put it, and explicitly stated, is a strategy. And considering this, how can leaders translate the sense making process into a clear, actionable strategy?
I think the way to understand sense making, it is a part of the strategy process, but the important thing is that sense making is a natural human condition. We do it constantly. New information comes in, we encode that information, okay? And the way we make sense out of information depends on the logical narrative that we hear in our head. Okay, so if our system crashes because too many people were getting on it, and I look at that and I'm looking at that through the narrative of our strategy, which is to have all the Democrats get on the platform together, then through that narrative, through that logical lens, through that strategy, I'm thinking of all of these Republicans trying to get on the website as a problem. But if instead I say, wait a minute, all of these people trying to get on that's actually questioning assumption behind my strategy. Now I'm seeing it as an opportunity. So one person's problem is another person's opportunity, depending on what the lens is that they use to make sense out of that information. So the tool we use for sense making is our strategy. And remember, strategy is the logic that explains why we win. And so it's the logic of our strategy that tells us how to understand new information when it happens. Every time you help your people understand new information, you're basically teaching them. And great leaders are teachers.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And could you share examples of organizations where effective sense making led to significant strategic advantages?
Well, I think the Airbnb example is exactly that, right? And in fact, anytime all those discovery examples, like the Apple case that I put in the, in the curriculum that you studied, those are all examples of where sense making was key to gaining advantage.
Okay, let's then talk a bit about another crucial function of leadership, which is providing direction. Professor, are you with us? Yes. Just providing direction. You've already touched that providing direction is another crucial function of leadership, and you stressed that leaders should move away from rigid planning and focus on dynamic discovery. Could you elaborate more on this idea and shed some light how leaders can start to seeing strategy as an evolving discovery process rather than a fixed plan?
Absolutely. So, of course, everybody does planning, and you should be doing planning. Planning is very important, okay? However, it's also understood that no plan survives execution. As soon as we begin to execute any plan, everything changes. And so, the worst possible thing you can do is expect that the plan you put in place is going to be executed according to plan. What actually happens is that during execution, new information comes in. By definition, the new information that comes in is information that you didn't know that you didn't know, right? Because if you knew you didn't know it, you would have done market. But what happens is you get blindsided, absolutely blindsided by new information. And that new information now feeds the strategy process. You make sense of it, and then that gives you new direction. So if you think about it, sense making and direction go hand in hand. Let's go back to the example that is in the lead material, okay? And the new lead material uses Apple as its example of discovery. If we have any leaders on the call from the very earliest days of lead, I used to use NetApp as the example. But both of them are good examples. It's just the Apple example is obviously the more current one. And what's interesting about Apple is that, Steve Jobs was trying to, when he re-entered Apple in the year 2000, was trying to move Apple in the direction of succeeding in the desktop computer business. That's in the year 2000. That was a market they had already lost, and it was a boring market. But that was their strategy. And the logic was they would have great software, so you'd have to buy an Apple computer to get that software, and it failed. But in the process, they found out that people were willing to pay 99 cents to download music. And if you remember for those of you, that was what you studied in lead, that was a real eye-opener. They had 10 million downloads in the month of September, and it shocked them. They had not planned on becoming a music company, but that was what was happening. They weren't selling more computers, but they were selling 10 million songs in the month of September. And that was only to people who owned an Apple computer, which was only 3% of the market. So they opened up the software to Windows computers, and the rest is history, right? It took off, and they ended up dropping the name computer from Apple. It just became Apple. Now, that is discovery in action. Okay, that's where new information comes in, and it's not obvious what you're going to do. Now, because of our tendency to retrospectively rationalize, it looks obvious that they should have done that. That was not true at the time, because they had a strategy. They had a plan. The plan said they would sell more computers, but the plan wasn't working. They weren't selling more computers. What they were selling was music. And so they had to be willing to essentially allow their strategy to change and to make sense of the new information, the way it questioned the underlying assumptions of their old strategy, and come up with a new strategy. So that's sense making and direction, altering the plan. And then you end up with the success you have now. So yes, absolutely, we want planning, but that plan, once you start executing, requires ongoing sense making. And what we learn from that sense making is direction. Now, if you remember, Steve Jobs had a quote which was where he talked about connecting the dots. He said, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. You can't connect the dots looking forward. Okay, that's the sense making. But once you connect the dots, now you can use that to guide action looking forward. That's the direction. So it's sense making looking backwards and using what you learn from that for direction looking forward.
Thank you so much, Professor. So you spoke in your work about the discovery process and the fear of being a fool. Can you explain how leaders can create an environment that encourages experimentation and innovation without fearing failure?
I think the best way to create an organization like that is to walk the talk. Okay, to take risks yourself, to be willing to reward people who experiment even when they fail. I was working with one company, and we put in place down in Santa Monica, California, and it was a tech firm down there that was having trouble getting a culture of experimentation. So we actually created a provision in their human resource policies so that you could not be promoted above the director level until you had been involved in a failed project. And they lived it. Literally, the candidate pool, you could not be in a candidate pool if you had not been part of a failed project. And so, of course, right away, what happened is everybody went back and said, oh, I was part of this, and they tried to spin like a humble brag, like, oh, yeah, we failed. No. They said, no, that wasn't a failure. We know what the failures were, and you haven't been part of one. And so it was really weird. Sort of people were looking at each other like, they're serious. I have to be part of a failed project before I can be promoted. It's the same way that the special forces in the United States military have to have combat exposure. And until they have combat exposure, they cannot be in a leadership, because you would not want somebody leading the special forces unit who doesn't know what combat's about. Well, it's the same in business. If you've never had it tough, I don't want you leading me. So you want to put mechanisms in place that reward experimentation. Obviously, nobody's ever going to want to fail, right? Nobody's going to want to fail. I know I have a question that came in on the chat that I'd like to take. It's a pretty cool question. It came in as a one-on-one, so I think somebody didn't want to be identified. That's okay. It says, what happens if my CEO doesn't listen to me? And well, I never wait for leadership. I'm just going to speak personally here, okay? I'm a change agent at Stanford University. And I ask forgiveness and not permission, okay? Because there's nobody less innovative than a dean, right? I mean, it just, even if I say the word dean, it just sounds like it's made of cement, right? These are people with tenure. They have no desire to change. We have a motto in Stanford: change lives, change organizations, change the world. I think that motto should read: change lives, change organizations, change the world, but don't change Stanford, right? Because it's very hard to make change happen around here. And so I just do it. And then when stuff works, then the dean gets in line. So I would stop blaming the CEO for you not being innovative, okay? And I know that hurts when I say it that way, but it's our job to be innovative no matter what. And if the CEO doesn't get it, that's her problem. So look, I gotta go because I know it's 29 after, and was 30 after now, and I've got but I got to get to it's a hard stop for me. So I want to thank you, Juliana and Yana, and I want to thank everybody. And I look forward to hearing from you at william.barnett@stanford.edu. Good luck, leaders.
Thank you, Bill. It was an honor.
Thank you so much.
As Bill shared with us his invaluable insights, and I think our conversation has shed the light on critical functions of leadership, sense-making, and direction, and to the power of adaptability and discovery. And as Bill aptly put it, discovery beats planning, so plan to discover. So what I can say that this motto we can all carry with us in our strategic journey, and we look forward to having you with us in our upcoming discussions where we will continue to explore this multifaceted world of leadership with renowned experts. And until then, keep the sense of curiosity alive and continue to master great things.
Yes, and I want to mention that this discussion was crafted from your questions to Professor Barnett. A big thank you for that, especially to Luigi and Kiki for their insightful queries. Your involvement shapes these sessions and making them both relevant and engaging. And it's the crowdsourced agenda that allows us to tackle real challenges faced by leaders. So keep sharing your questions and experiences. They help us co-create a learning environment that resonates with your leadership journey. Your voice is crucial in making each session insightful and impactful.
Right. And one last addition that the learning doesn't stop here, and stay with us for our next episode with Sarah So, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Foundational Leadership in LEAD, where it will be another enlightening conversation for our community about the application of leadership skills after the LEAD program.
And now, as we wrap up, I'd like to invite all our listeners to join our Leadership Lab group on Workplace. It's a space where we continue this important conversation, share insights, and support each other on our leadership journeys. And you can keep up with the future episodes, have your questions fuel our conversations, and get the recording of today's session with Professor Barnett. It will be available next week for those who want to revisit the insights. And the journey of translating theory into actionable leadership continues, and we are thrilled to have you along. Until then, keep engaging in our Workplace group and keep leading with insight and purpose. Thank you.